Welcome, everybody, to Road Work Ahead, a podcast that explores the unmapped future of business and technology. My name is Sam Girt, and I am your host. How do you approach your duty and responsibility to protect yourself and those around you from cyber threats? Whether you're a large organization or an individual, it's never right to assume that someone else is protecting your best interests. Our generation is living in an incredibly significant transitional period, and the rules and expectations about how people should be treated are still being tested and hotly debated. The only way to ensure that you and your business remain safe is to take personal responsibility for that safety. In addition, we should also be lining up to preserve the safety of the more vulnerable members of our community, the older and younger generations. This week, I sat down with Kristi Hoffmaster, who is a senior analyst at Okta, a company that provides secure identity management for businesses of all sizes. Kristi's experience and expertise in third-party risk management yielded a conversation that centered around the need to carefully evaluate and monitor the technology that you allow into your business and your life. While we spent a good deal of time talking about the specifics of securing an organization's technology stacks, it was the individual human aspect of cybersecurity that resonated most deeply for me. I was left at the end of our conversation feeling very confident that the only way for humankind to ensure our future cyber safety is to begin fostering a strong sense of individual responsibility across the board. I hope this discussion leads you to the same conclusion. Kristi, you are in third-party risk management, which, to my understanding, is not a specialized role. It's more of a general role. You have eyes on every part of cybersecurity. Is that correct?
That's right. Third-party risk management, also known as VRM or vendor risk management. They usually mean the same things.
So you have eyes on then auditing companies, looking at every aspect of cybersecurity. As you're looking at the industry, because everybody knows that this is shifting and changing so rapidly, as you're looking at all types of business, small business, large business, what would you say is the greatest challenge that you're facing in the next 5 years?
So the challenge I would say is, first of all, for a company, understanding what's there, what is their inventory, what suppliers exist that that company is doing business with, and then from a TPRM assessor standpoint, when you're looking at suppliers and their businesses, I would say they're understanding kind of two lanes. The first lane would be what is the baseline what are we doing business with from a baseline assessment static point in time, what is this organization structure, what is the primary systems that this organization is made out of, and then how are they managing those risks across their organization. So that's the first lane. The second lane would be periodically seeing what has changed about that company, what has have there been incidents that would affect that company's operations or how they service the companies that it does business with. And then just looking at what is the response to those changes. Has the response been nothing? Has it been, an auditor has come in and attested to the fact that they've handled this change in some way, hopefully in a positive way. So those two lanes are kind of what an assessor, third-party risk management professional is looking at. The challenge for an organization that is being assessed by TPRM evaluator would be the overwhelm, because there are multiple inquiries and there are multiple questions that a TPRM professional would issue and request from that company or that supplier.
Yeah.
So sometimes those teams that are, like I mentioned, the trust team, the assurance team would be the team in-house fielding those questions and responding to those inquiries. A company that does business, a larger company that does business with, hundreds of other companies, they could be answering thousands of questions a month from these external companies. So there's a lot of overwhelm in this field as well. And there needs to be a strategy from leadership and managing both sides of TPRM and how to kind of optimize and deal with that function efficiently. Otherwise, it could be, um, anywhere from one extreme of legal liability to the other extreme of just, burnout from employees working in this field from a subjective standpoint.
It seems to me that this thing that you're talking about, all of this overwhelm, is going to be the greater challenge for the small business versus a larger corporation. And we're getting to the point now where the small business can't ignore cybersecurity and really needs services like what you're talking about. But half the time, they're not even aware that it's a need. And then the other half, when they become aware, they're, like you said, they're overwhelmed at the very prospect of undergoing even an audit.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, when you're discussing these things with a smaller business who's facing that challenge, what's the response?
Sure. I think small business owners and those who are involved in protecting a small business can do the same thing that third party risk management professionals do, which is look at the data. The data is the crown jewels. The data is really the king of your business. So, what step back and, like, from a very high level, you might want to do this once or twice a year. A small business owner can say, what kind of data does my business handle and manage and deal with? What kind of promises do I need to make to my customers to protect that data? Obviously, a landscaping small business is going to have financial data if they take digital payments. They're going to
Yeah.
have, invoicing, personal data on some of their customers that they need to protect. How are they protecting that? What systems are they using? So if they're using a cloud point of sale system to handle financial transactions, they need to be looking at, first of all, internally, what what can they do procedurally to handle that data properly, and then looking at the actual third party vendor that is providing those financial transactional services, looking at, is this a company that just created itself, last week and is using your business as a guinea pig? Is it a friend's, startup? In that case, you're taking on some risk. There's not a lot of, history there to prove that they've maturely been able to handle that capability. Or are you handling, are you using a very well established cloud vendor that's been around for a long time that has a track record of protecting data and dealing with challenges in a transparent way with its customers? Those are the kind of things you, on a high level, would want to do as a small business owner.
Are there any other things that you would consider if you were evaluating a vendor as a small business, or are there any other red flags that you might look out for?
Sure, that's a really good question. The number one, I am employed with an identity provider company. So identity is how you're logging into an application. How are you authenticating, and how are you doing that safely? I happen to work for a company that, our pride is, promising that we can help businesses secure that authentication handshake. Um, so the number one red flag, I would say, is if a small business, is wanting to take payments but not requiring any kind of single sign-on authentication to its application. That would be a huge red flag. Or just that the system of record for your business with them and operating and sharing that data doesn't have consistency, or maybe it's not even present. Those would be red flags.
So, to give an example, so I work for, we do digital marketing, digital sales. We're in this digital space as an agency. And a big part of my job is recommending software as a service platforms for companies to run things like marketing and sales. And the average size of a tech stack for a company that we would work with, depending on the size of the business, but even the landscaping business, as an example, is going to have at least a dozen vendors.
Mhm.
And the tech stack for a larger mid-sized company, say, is going to be way higher, maybe even close to 50, 60, 70 vendors. And so as we're evaluating these vendors that sometimes we resell them, sometimes we recommend them, sometimes we just test them and use them ourselves, and then if the need arises, we have it as a recommendation. You're looking at it completely differently than the way we look at it. We look at it and we see pricing, we see feature set capability, we might look at customer reviews, we might hop on a call with a salesman from that provider and hear more about the internal workings of the company from them.
For sure.
But what we lack a lot of times, and a lot of times it's not even available to us, what we lack is insight into their security, their cybersecurity practices, compliances, all of that stuff. And so I'm curious, for my own benefit and for the benefit of our customers, what's the mark of a really conscientious vendor that you're not going to get that email that says, "Hey, we had a data breach. Your credit card might have been exposed."
Right. Okay, that's a great question. So I think that there are, on a positive note, there are actions you can take um, from that perspective, sitting in that chair, that don't require a lot of legwork. First of all, in this day and age, most people, and there have been studies that show this with consumer purchasing habits, most human beings do a little bit of research on their own before they even engage another party in a transaction or a question or any kind of engagement. So you can look at their privacy policy, which should be on their website. If a company doesn't have a website, that's not necessarily a red flag, but that is an easy way to tell a hallmark of this is a company I want to do business with. They have some
Yeah.
kind of statement that is publicly available for customers to look at and see how do they handle information? What kind of commitments do they make to you, a consumer, or you, another business that they're doing business with? And how are they going to promise that they are going to make an effort to protect that information? Also, usually, most likely, if you scroll down on any application or any software or any business or organizational website, there should be at the very bottom of the privacy policy a small paragraph that speaks to how you can engage that company, how you can communicate with them, whether it's a phone number, email address. And so you can look very quickly. If that's there, that means we are open to talking with you and working with you. There's also legal reasons and regulatory reasons that that business might be subject to providing that information, which is another reason they do it. So usually a privacy policy would be present, as well as a security statement or some kind of portal or page speaking to what frameworks are they compliant with, what kind
Yeah.
of, regulations do they acknowledge that they're out there and that they are subject to keeping your information safe with.
Yeah, you actually bring up an interesting secondary point to this whole thing, and that is, it's not just ensuring that your data is safe from outside attack when you engage with a third party. It's also making sure that that party is going to be responsible with it themselves. And
Absolutely.
we're seeing more and more of this. There was the incident with Zoom where they had changed their policy to indicate that data collected on the platform could potentially be used in the training of LLMs, AI, and people lost their minds.
Yeah, there's a
People,
lot
there
of
was a
and there was a lot of industry pushback there.
yeah, there was a huge backlash, and they walked it back, and they tried to say no, 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 that's not what we meant. But it was very apparent that they intended to quietly allow themselves access to that data for that purpose. And customers obviously did not want that. So how do we protect it? You can have the most compliant vendor in the entire world, and if that vendor chooses to use your data in a way that you don't want them to, what's the recourse other than leaving them?
Leaving them is one recourse. There is strength in numbers when, customer behavior can influence a company's response and posture for sure. And that's kind of what happened here with Zoom is there was a lot of noise in response to what had been reported. So you bring up a really good point, which I would probably tie this point to a lot of questions that someone like you could ask about cybersecurity, which is the importance of socialization and normalization of the human factor in protecting information. So it can, work on both sides. The human factor can influence company behavior in that type of scenario where people are just saying, we don't like this. This isn't right. We don't want to enter this territory of information being used in a way that we aren't sure, the outcome. And then on the other side, there's the human factor. And you brought up this question with what can organizations do internally to keep those promises. There's the
Yeah.
human factor of just, there's always subjectivity when it comes to human beings making decisions, and they can be safe decisions or unsafe decisions. So what someone in TPRM wants to see a company do is have those internal controls that are administered within the company, background checks for employees, security training happening, regularly, whether it's once a year or, upon hire, and then every quarter or twice a year. You would want to see those types of things and activities happening. You would want to see an auditor coming in and attesting that they have looked at that and that activity is actually present and working as intended. So, as far as public recourse, there's, we live in a society and a culture, fortunately, where there is the ability to discuss this and have public recourse about it. And that's what can really happen. And in this situation with Zoom is where you have customers saying, what's happening? We don't appreciate this. And then you have practitioners from the industry breaking it down and saying, here are the risks that this could introduce, and here are the things that we see wrong with this picture. So public recourse is actually really effective in a lot of situations.
It just comes down to then whether or not you can uncover it. Before we get to that individual responsibility, that individual vigilance, there's one more thing that I want to touch on, a challenge of the small business that kind of goes along with that, building a tech stack and just a kind of outsourcing to these third-party vendors pieces of your business. And that is when we do this, especially on the small business side, I see this all the time, there's this assumption of just letting go. And okay, they handle that. I don't have to think about that. So we saw this a lot with GDPR and the data privacy rules that came out of GDPR. There was this idea, this attitude that my vendors will be compliant. My vendors will sort this out. I don't need to necessarily know the inner workings of this law and how it affects me because I'm using a very popular vendor. Therefore, if they're compliant, I'm compliant. I don't need to worry about this. They're worrying about it for me. Is that always a good idea?
No. Great question. Um, you can take that statement and you can blast it out to a macro perspective for a company like the one I work for and have the same problem, which we
Mhm.
do. Large companies have this challenge, which is continuing to have a pulse on what is happening. Number one, with your data, with your customers' data, continuing to understand what those promises that vendor is making to you are, and what is the termination of those promises. So now we're looking at the legal contractual agreements. You are most likely going to sign a purchase order and a contract with that business and that vendor that you're handling your business and giving them part of your data to. So what are those, what's in the contract? So I would say for a company like the one I work for, and for you as a small business owner or anyone out there, you need to have someone in house, whether it's you or someone that you hire part time, full time, that handles those relationships and what I would call the supplier inventory that is helping operate your business. So because ultimately the business is accountable for any problems, any residual problems, or any just gaps with omission of knowledge of what's going on that could introduce data loss, financial loss. It could affect your, let's say, your employee. You've got 20 employees and your scheduling cloud vendor is not available for 2 days, and something goes down and that affects your operations. That's a good example. So having that resource, whether it's you or someone else, to understand um, what has been agreed in writing, how long do those agreements last, and what is Amazon kind of coined this for their industry landscape, which is the phrase of shared responsibility and having the shared responsibility model. And what that means is, what is the vendor responsible for, and what are you as the customer of that vendor responsible for doing on a regular basis? And a good example would be, let's say your cloud vendor is responsible for the infrastructure and that platform and providing that to you and being available 99.5% of the time. They make that
Yeah.
promise to you. They ask you to be responsible in this example for patching the software that lives in that cloud instance. That's your responsibility as a business. So if that goes down and it's on your watch because you haven't patched it in 13 months, that would
Yeah.
be your accountability that you would be facing. So having someone in house that can look at what the promises are and what the responsibilities are from you as a business and from them, then you kind of have a template of, you can apply that to any vendor that you do business with, whether it's 5 or 20 or 100 vendors.
And something additional that I think a lot of small businesses neglect to think about is the fact that their vendors have vendors.
Yes.
And this relationship is just not two people or two
Hmm.
companies. This relationship is your relationship with this organization who has a relationship with dozens of organizations, and those organizations.
And some of those vendors are open source products. So there is no company managing that organization that's providing that software to you, for example. So you might be reliant on an open source project that is handling some aspect of your business. And that's important to know as well.
So for every listener out there, what we're saying is you need somebody knowledgeable about all of this stuff to evaluate your business decisions with regards to who you work with, and don't just take, a simple reputation metric as gold and go from there. You need to have somebody who's constantly on top of this.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's the cost of doing business in
Yeah.
2023 and beyond.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's really good to hear you say that. That's a lot of what I do in my capacity is evaluating vendors for specific tasks and looking at all of this, and it is a challenge.
Yeah, and you have to look at jurisdiction too. Who is your company doing business with? Locals within a 30-mile radius, and that's your jurisdiction, is the state you're in and operating in, or are you subject to laws and regulations all over the world? It depends on what your business is doing.
Yeah, yeah, it gets really complicated as soon as you go global. I'll tell you that.
Yes.
So let's get into then the individual's responsibility. This is for businesses; they have responsibility, but also for employees. I feel like there's this great need for everyone in every capacity, whether you're at home sitting on your couch or at work sitting at your desk, driving, even these days. You have to have this awareness of all of the things that are happening around you, how they're affecting you, and how they're affecting your family, your organization. Data is constantly being collected. We are constantly interfacing with platforms who are watching us, collecting data on us, and using that data, whether it's toward us or for the benefit of a company somewhere else. That data is being used, and so we talk about vigilance with your individual accounts, two-factor authentication, email confirmation, all of these other little things that most people are aware of. But there's also just this general need for, I think, a basic cybersecurity education
Mhm.
across the board.
Agree.
Is that something that we're seeing more of on the company level? Are companies getting on board with this and providing this kind of information, or are we still woefully behind?
Well, I grew up, I'm going to date myself here, but I grew up in this industry. I started in IT many, many years ago. And so security was, the phrase is that it was bolted on. And now systems and organizations are attempting to operate with security and privacy by design as a concept and a best practice. So I do think that, and it's been forced on us culturally and society to become more mindful and aware, because it's not really a matter of if, it's a matter of when things are stolen in the society that we live in digitally. So I do think there's more awareness, which is great. We're coming on the annual presence of cybersecurity awareness month that happens every year around this time, that CISA, one of our United States federal agency, promotes each year, and to the common public, with publications and tips and best practice reminders. So there are activities like that happen on a cyclical basis that can help us be more mindful. But going back to, you know, cybersecurity traditionally was thought of as endpoints and firewalls to a network. And now it's everything. It's data
Yeah.
management, it's the network, it's the human factor. So going back to that aspect, um, I would say one of the most costly and impactful and expensive impacts to any company or any organization, hospital, school, anything, would be, ransomware, and taking that data and those systems and holding them hostage, as well as
Yeah.
social engineering. The tactics and the threats are out there, and they're more sophisticated than ever. So, as a baseline best practice, individuals, should be handling their credentials in very, very safe manners, like not writing down passwords. We're way past that age. You should be using a vault and using multi-factor authentication with phishing resistant mechanisms for every authentication login that you personally have. So I'm a parent. I grew up, raising my children, like most parents, wanting to protect our family. And I would make that analogy from a family to a company with operations. You want to protect your family's physical structure, their brains, their citizenry, their, spiritual, soul, and everything else. As a parent, you would want to protect that child that's vulnerable. You might even set up some best practices for protecting your family with disciplining and correction, working with your family and your partners in the village that's raising that child or those children. So it might seem far fetched, but you could even take it to your family as taking that responsibility that you're talking about, and write a policy and a procedure for how your family handles digital best practices and applications in your home. Everything's going to look different depending on what family and how you're raised. But for example, you can make a policy that doesn't allow your children to do certain things with technology. So those are ways that you can and have responsibility, helping educate people, whether it's older or younger, understand what happens when you download that application. What are you giving that vendor access to
Yeah.
then and residually? So those are steps that you can take for responsibility. But I do think that companies are doing a better job of training the workforce and understanding everything from best practices to innovative steps to be mindful of, like, AI and deep fakes. What should we look for?
Yeah.
So just helping understand what your expectations are for yourself and for anyone that you're responsible for, whether it be a family or a school or a business. Having those things that are aware, and those expectations laid out, is really important.
We've arrived at this place, and I think we've been here for a little while, where we really need to be looking out for the more vulnerable and lifting them up and coming alongside. I think you touched on it, but you think about the older generation and the younger generation. The older generation that didn't grow up with this stuff, with these threats, is woefully incapable of managing the real threats that are kind of at their doorstep. And in many ways, they're the more targeted demographic as well, because they're the ones that have money. They're the ones that have something to take. And so you think about the myriad of scams that prey on the elderly. This is something that we, as the generation who is in charge, really should be helping with. I mean, I feel very strongly about this, but
I do too.
it pains me to see how we've kind of left a generation behind, and to watch, as an example, to watch our grandparents try to navigate social media so that they can see family pictures that they would have had other ways of seeing 15, 20 years ago. To expect them to adopt a platform that they're very unfamiliar with, and then all of the wolves that exist on that platform, it we do a disservice to them. And then the flip side of that is children. To hand a child a piece of technology like a phone or a tablet without that education that comes alongside of it, understanding, like you said, what happens when you download this app. What
Mm-hmm.
exactly is happening when you download this app? And then having those conversations too, where you say, listen, you may not be thinking about this right now, but what you do on this device will come back to you in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, because they're remembering. The people that you're dealing with, the companies, the devices that you're dealing with, they're
Right. The
remembering.
data. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that I totally agree with you. I mentioned Cybersecurity and Awareness Month. It is coming up. There are posters and flyers and reminders about those types of, statements reminding you. But I think to go back to a parenting analogy, when you, whether it's a person or an entity, an organization, when you have the responsibility to protect another party that is, less able and maybe has less insight, or just you're keeping that promise to protect that person or that entity and that party, you have to realize the responsibility. And then, like you're saying, we should take more ownership. You should lay out what are the expectations. So it just comes down to basic expectations. For example, you would tell a 3-year-old child in a parking lot, um, my expectation is that you hold my hand as we make this journey into this place, and I'm not going to let go of your hand. And if someone else were to come up, hypothetically, and ask to take your hand, you should never do that. You should never expect that someone wanting to do that has your best interest in mind. So, laying out to the elderly, this is what you should expect to see here. And if you don't see that, or if you see such and such, it's malicious, most likely. So, just people understanding what's to be expected. That's where people who are own a business, don't own a business, been to school for cybersecurity or not, that's when, people who have a little bit more awareness, that's our responsibility to communicate that. I definitely agree there.
And so moving forward, what we would like to see, what I would like to see, is companies, especially small businesses, taking this seriously and inviting professionals in, not necessarily in a business capacity where they're being invited in for a professional audit, but inviting them in and saying, hey, listen, we're going to buy lunch. We'll pay you for your time, but we want you to just talk to us about these things and bring our people up to
Hmm.
speed.
Yeah.
Those kind of like lunch and learn environments. I would love to see more of that on the smaller scale.
Hmm.
And then on the larger scale, I think there's this need for larger companies to recognize that not every employee is on the same page with this, and there needs to be this conscientious effort to make sure that you're not leaving someone behind, especially as you think about like all of the innovation happening around AI. There's a lot of people who are just really insecure about all of this, and most of that's coming from ignorance. I think they've not been brought along.
Exactly. And we talk about diversity and inclusion from something that we business owners are more and more aware of as well. One way that you can have include people that work for you in your conversations is combine training with fun. You want to boost your employees' morale, you want them to stay engaged, you want them to enjoy working for your company. My suggestion would be combine some of that, bringing experts in, and combine it with an outing or a fun activity where you have not just someone talking to your workforce, but having an actual engaging conversation where all questions are welcome, all ideas are welcome. There, curiosity is really something that can boost morale in your company. So the more you allow healthy, curious debate and conversation and inquiry, the more that you have productivity, and that training just kind of happens organically. You can have that coupled with formal training as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's so needed. It will become very helpful for the companies who do adopt a culture of this education.
Yeah, we have to, because we're in this interim generation and time in
Mm.
history. The White House just pushed out a strategy for enhancing cybersecurity in the workforce just very recently. I think it was about a month ago or so. So you're going to see the impact of that directive coming from the US government. You're going to see that residually happening, where cybersecurity is normalized, and just talking about it's going to be like we don't refer to the phone as a smartphone anymore. It's that language is kind of past us. We just say phone, and we all know it's a smartphone. So
Yeah.
normalizing safety, classes about digital safety and privacy and security, those are going to be coming into high school and middle school curriculum over the next decade. So that's going to be something that's advantageous for that generation, because they will grow up with that mindfulness. But we're in this interim phase where we have to step back and say not everyone grew up around this, and not everyone understands the importance of keeping information safe and how it could impact your business if you don't.
We're coming to this point too, and I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on this. We're going to get it more into the realm of speculation here, but uh, we we've seen some scary stuff with the capabilities of artificial intelligence to do things like, just passive learning, where it's just constantly churning data behind the scenes. There's no directive. It's just a machine processing these points of data and coming up with these insights that are unbelievably accurate. And then the flip side of that is we're giving more eyes to these systems, more inputs, more sensors, and I feel like we're getting to this point to where even our, like you were saying, we've shifted from a bolted on approach to security to more of an integrated approach to security. Even there, I feel like we're so far behind that now we've got agents that in particular tasks can act with superhuman intelligence to analyze data and produce insights that could produce malicious attacks on individuals, and then also could do things like brute force, but brute force in creative ways where it's not even necessarily just trying a million passwords. It's listening, on your phone, on your device. It's using those sensors that it's been given to try to break its way into your life. These are things that we can't necessarily protect against with single sign-on because the approach is it's so human. How do we adapt to that?
Wow, I would never presume to be the expert voice on how on speaking on how to address this. There are many voices out there, and it is that question, and asking that is kind of the golden question right now for the
Yeah.
world. um, NIST has put out an AI risk management framework recently, and an AI resource and trust center that people and organizations can go to and kind of get the most recent questions and guidance from hundreds of private sector and federal contributions. So I would highly recommend everyone check that out. Um, I would say the challenge is inferring from what you were getting at. The challenge is we don't know. And when you don't know, as a TPRM professional, when we don't know the presence or absence of something, we assume the worst, or we assume the highest risk is involved. So cybersecurity terminology that covers that would be zero trust. So there's the
Okay.
concept of when you are looking at something, or when data is moving, when systems are interacting, you assume the worst. So there's zero trust. The gate is closed. Everything needs to be tightened up. So, from a technical control aspect, what you would want to do is have as much monitoring as possible. When the
Mm,
eyes and the inputs are myriad and just out there exponentially, you have no idea there's thousands or millions of data flow inputs and connections. You would want to be monitoring that activity as much as possible. From a small business perspective, that's not always easy to do, but the number one primary way that you can address authentication handshakes and those gates where that data is coming and going in transit is single sign-on, is phishing resistant multi-factor
mm,
authentication. So you can, for example, say every system that our business uses must have this enabled. If it can't, if the vendor cannot capably, provide that single sign-on function and that MFA function, then we won't do business with them. That's just a
mm.
requirement these days because we don't want that data leaking. Um, Another thing that organizations can do is create an AI policy that's appropriate for your workforce. You could say the scope of this policy applies to everyone in the company and everyone in the organization and everyone who contracts with us to do services for us. And then you could say, we are only going to allow this type of data to be processed from any system that uses AI. It could be anything that's publicly available to our company or our customers, or it could be, this kind of information is off limits, and you train your workforce to say, you know, if you're going to work here and be an employee, you've got to promise and commit to not putting such and such type of data into these systems, not sharing this type of information because we don't know yet. And then having those resources to be able to technically look at what's happening.
Yeah.
Every technical software company these days should have experts who understand APIs and understand what kind of permissions and what kind of data is flowing with those APIs and what are the settings, what are the configurations for them. So yeah, we're there. We're at a day where we look at the unknowns and we have to kind of assume the worst and understand more about what systems are doing, and opt out where you can. That it's just
Yeah.
reading, understanding those terms and understanding the terms of service for applications that your company is reliant on.
That's actually a really good answer to the question. I know that was a hard question.
That's
that
okay.
was
Thank you.
that was
It
a
is a very big question right now.
it is it's so big. If we're going to talk cybersecurity, we have to talk about it because I feel like the cybersecurity industry has done such a great job of responding to the pressure of 5 years ago, just in time for us to see this new existential threat. And I don't mean, existential threat in the sense that AI is going to wipe out humanity, but existential threat in the sense that all of a sudden we're facing intelligence, computer intelligence that is incredibly capable when acting maliciously, just like it's incredibly capable when acting for our good.
Yeah, and getting your arms around that is a huge challenge. Just like I would make an analogy to social media. Some of the CEOs of the most prominent AI companies have faced Congress very recently saying,
Yeah.
we don't want to see a repeat of social media revolution happening with AI. In other words, we're asking for partnership with government to form legislation and regulation around this industry. But it's a global, and that's another aspect of it. It's a global aspect of importance that we
Mm,
understand, and this is something we need to teach the most vulnerable as well, is that we do not live in our very narrow scoped society, local culture anymore. This is a global world that we live in, and we are globally dependent on each other, and we are globally connected, and the threats are global. So it is really important to understand that as we go forward.
do you feel optimistic that that's going to be the case, that we will be able to control, to regulate the explosion of these technologies, or is it going to be the Wild West like it was with social media?
I think that it's an exciting, dance of caution and innovation that's
Yeah.
happening. Um, Leadership in large tech companies, we're all looking for the competitive edge and to see, like, how this plays out and who the key players in these spaces are and how AI can innovate and help foster innovation. So, on one hand, I'm very optimistic. Healthcare, technology, security. I think that AI is going to bring a tremendous amount of innovation. I do also think, like social media, there's going to be more accountability. You look at the
Mm,
way that human beings operate now versus a decade ago with social media, there is more accountability. If there is an altercation happening in a public square and someone is live streaming that to a social media platform, there is accountability where there used to not be that. I
yeah.
heard on the news the other day the IRS either has or is stating that they will have the capability to rapidly investigate and analyze tax return information and data with AI, in order to
Mm,
foster more accountability to the taxpayer. So um, there will be more accountability across the board as well, but there will be accidents and bumps along the way. Hopefully, they're not
yeah.
tremendously harmful to society, but who's to say? It's an exciting time to be a human being on this earth and in
It
outer
is.
space.
Yes, yeah. We're not just on the earth anymore, are we? Kind of getting right into that as well. You know, we talk about this generation being a generation of transition, and um, looking at initiatives that are going to be better for the younger generation coming up. Um, we are going to leave them with a very different world. And so, what are the ways in which we prepare the younger generation so that, as kids are getting into, that career age, um, they're choosing a path that's going to be both beneficial for them, but also beneficial for the world. And I think specifically with regards to things like cybersecurity, um, what are the ways that we can foster the
Hmm.
right attitude?
That is such a great question. That kind of gets to the core of what I'm passionate about, at this point in my life. Um, yeah, what a weighty responsibility we have in this generation. Like I said, I am a mom. I have children, um, who are very much growing up in a culture that can be very frightening. There's a
Mm,
lot of unknowns. My son said to me the other day, we were having dinner, maybe it was last night even, you know, Mom, this is a crazy world to grow up in. It's just crazy.
mm,
Um, so I think, I mentioned our our government, our culture is trying to foster a quick pivot. Nothing happens quickly in government, but a pivot to an attitude of, um, by design, conceptually educating humans as they grow up in primary and secondary education to understand the importance of keeping information safe and understanding how it impacts your personal safety, with
yeah.
infrastructure and considering just the larger aspect of keeping systems safe. So We have a cyber force, a space force arm now in our military branches that is looking at satellite technology, looking at securing everything above and around and below us. So encouraging people to understand that there are so many opportunities for them to work and do this work, and then stepping back. There's that viral meme about disasters where people say it's Mr. Rogers and he says, look for the workers. Those are the ones in a crisis that will be, those are the ones doing the good. And so stepping back and saying, which side do you want to be on? Do you want to
Mm.
be on the helper side, or do you want to be on the side creating harm? And so I know it sounds cliche, but to me, there's a lot of work to be done in protecting human life and protecting organizations and systems. There's a ton of work to be done, and there's a lot of, paths that you could take to do that work. And it's way more exciting, in my opinion.
We talked a little bit about normalizing some of this stuff, and we have, I think the stigma is dying away finally, but there was a time when I was growing up, this was the case, where there were the computer geeks and everybody else. And now it seems like what we need is an entire generation of computer geeks if we're going to get through this safely. Is that something that you'd agree with? I'm assuming the answer is absolutely yes.
Yeah, I mean there have been publications from multiple agencies in our government about the dire need for increasing cyber workforce. But yeah, I think since practically everything has gone digital in the last decade, this generation of students, it makes complete sense that things
Mm,
are out there and need to be kept safely secure. But there's so many fields that one person could go into, and the beauty of cyber, especially TPRM that I'm in, or any GRC role in cybersecurity, is that you don't have to try on one hat and stay there. You could
yeah.
work in pen testing, you could work in vulnerability management, you could work in networking, and you could even work in engineering and then pivot across the landscape. There's so many paths. So I don't
Yeah.
think it's nerdy anymore. I think it's kind of really cool.
And I don't even mean that we necessarily need a full generation of people who are working in IT or cybersecurity or any of it, but there just needs to be this computer literacy
Hmm.
so that even the guy, who's building houses has a computer literacy to the point that he can protect himself against ever increasingly capable systems, these intelligent systems who are, for better or worse, going to be looking at him.
Yeah, and I think that I personally, I don't know if you do this, Sam, but every December I sit down and I create a word, or I hone in on a word for the following year that it's my word, and I want to see and challenge myself and everything out there. I do a little personal retreat, I meditate, and I think about, well, like,
Mm.
what do I want my word to be, and how am I asking it and inviting it to come into like all my interactions in my work life, my personal life, everything. And it's so interesting. I've been doing it for about 7 years, and I see like how crazy in amazing ways that this word plays out. But I chose last year my word to be freedom. And
Mm.
I think you're hitting on my word there, is just the concept of everyone wants freedom. Everyone, no matter what they do for a living, no matter how much they get paid, what their salary is, what their net worth is, what their family looks like, where they live, they want freedom. So, the company I work for, our part of our motto is freeing people to safely use any technology. So, when
Mhm.
you look at that, the person who's owning or working with a small business. In South Carolina, we have I-85 going from South Carolina to North Carolina. There are men out there building that highway. That's what they do, sun up to sundown. They may
Yep.
not care about the app that they're using out there, and they may not. It may not matter to them. But once something happens with that application or that data that affects their freedom, that's when people's attention perks up, you know? So I think when you can tie cybersecurity and tie privacy to freedom and frame it in such a way that this is why this is important to us. We would like to have freedom to get into the things we need to get into, to wrap up
Yeah.
the things we need to wrap up at the end of the day, to walk away from things we don't have, you know, a need or interest in. That's why we care. We want to be free to use that technology.
It's a shame that we don't act more proactively when it comes to freedom. We do have that, reaction to when it's taken away, but we don't proactively protect it all the time. And I think, business. We've been talking about business. Also, individuals absolutely have to realize that just the mere existence of the majority of the technology today, it's not meant necessarily to make you more free.
Mm.
If you want freedom, if freedom is your word, then you've got to understand that just blindly adopting a technology because maybe it frees up 5 minutes of your time per day, or maybe it makes you
Convenience.
feel like
Yes.
you've gained convenience. That doesn't equate to freedom. And in many cases, what we're seeing these days is it actually equates to less freedom because you are handing over so much information, and that information is being used in ways that are not necessarily easy to recognize.
Yeah, that's a great point. We have data, and data is the commodity of, you know,
Mm.
so that is the biggest consideration really when it comes down to it is we're all interacting with technology and we are the consumer at the end of the day.
We saw that with social media. We saw, these platforms that were, free. They didn't cost money. But then you ask, how is this company valued at billions of dollars, and their product is free? Any thinking person's going to look at that and recognize, I'm the product. Like
Hmm.
I'm the value. Not my feed,
Exactly.
not my wall.
Yeah,
It's
there's
me.
some great books out there on that, on about, the social, the whole phenomenon of us being the product in this data commodity.
And we're going to see this again with AI. There are certain things that AI will not be able to do because it's not human. And humans, there's going to be the possibility, there's going to be the attempt to commoditize humans to augment AI.
Mm.
And it should be the other way around. AI should augment the human experience. And so we need to be aware of that, I think, and resist it wherever we can in the name of that freedom that you're talking about. Recognizing, and I think this has come up in every interview I've had so far, recognizing that AI is a tool and people are where the value is. And there's
For
going to be
sure.
that attempt to flip it around and say, oh, no, people are the tool. AI is where the value is. And for companies especially, I really want to see this conscientious rejection of that. And I want to see
Yeah,
it play out.
I think that as we are trained in cybersecurity, in that field, the best practice mindset to have is that security needs to enable business. Security
Mm,
doesn't need to get in the way of business. So I think that full circle to what you're saying, when we can secure technology, we free up what really needs to happen, which is people being people, people interacting, business operating. So security is often perceived as getting in the way, but really when security by design is followed in a business operations and in systems development and assessing it, looking at it, purchasing it, all of that, the whole life cycle, security can enable what needs to happen instead of getting in the way.
absolutely. So, one last question before we wrap this up. Considering all that we've talked about, if you were to sit down with small to mid-sized business owner, let's say small business owner today, what's the next step? We've talked about a lot here, but what's the practical next thing that this person needs to be thinking about?
Looking at your resources, what is your budget? What do you have available to yourself to invest in a internal resource, an advisory or legal guide, whether that's hiring someone or consulting with or outsourcing. So getting your arms around how can I secure what I have and how can I keep better promises to my customers that I'm going to keep their information safe. Um, Making that investment before you need to is going to pay off, in my opinion. That would be my one next step guidance. And then, of course, on a technical level, every point in your business where you need to have a credential and a login, secure that with MFA.
That's a good practical one because you can do that today.
You can do that over the weekend for sure.
One more thing, building trust. How do we build trust? When we're talking about communicating the value of trust, how do we do that when it comes to data and security?
That's great. Trust and transparency go hand in hand. So, openly stating what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it is really important. Every business could stand up a page that says business name dot domain slash trust. Explain what you're doing with your customers' data, why it's important to running the business. From a technical standpoint, software companies can actually produce an SBOM, a software bill of materials that shows what is in this software product, what vendor products, what libraries, what open source libraries are in this product. That
Mm,
came from an executive order from the US government, I think in 2021, which is asking companies to provide that software bill of materials from any private company, any company that's doing business with the government. But you can do that proactively. If you're a startup creating technology products, make an SBOM, would be my practical advice as well. That promotes trust and transparency, saying, here's what's in our stuff. Here's, you can take a look
yeah,
at it and analyze it and see it.
yeah,
And also just managing your vulnerabilities.
absolutely.
Looking at not just technical vulnerabilities with software, but looking at all your vulnerabilities. How are you managing those? That doesn't have to go on a public trust page, but that's something you can do internally and keep track of.
This has been such a good conversation.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
I feel like I'm only halfway through, but I'm absolutely gonna end it here. We may have to just have you back. There's so much that we could talk about here, but Kristi, this is an excellent start. I'm glad we got to focus on cybersecurity from an individual level, cybersecurity from that small business perspective, because I feel like these are the people who most need to be paying attention. And and I think once we get the ball rolling on this, there's so much more to talk about that may be on the more technical side. But for right now, this has been excellent.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.